President Levin, Dean Lorimer, faculty, students, thank you so much for making me feel so welcome here at Yale. I've wanted to come here for many years, and I'm so grateful to everyone for the hospitality and kindness you've shown to me and my staff. I've really been looking forward to seeing the Yale landmarks that I've heard about for so long now. The Beinecke Library, Harkness Tower, Old Campus, Peter Salome's mustache. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't make it quite in time for that last one. But everything else is even more impressive than I'd imagined. This is a spectacular place. Indeed, I have to admit, as I was preparing for this visit, I wondered what on earth I could tell you that you didn't already know. Yalees have won 17 Nobel Prizes, 6 presidential elections, and even 2 Heisman trophies. You can choose from more than 2,000 courses, browse more than 12 million books in the libraries, make friends from more than 110 countries, and as far as I can tell from the posters all around campus, tried for 3,000 a cappella singing groups. So rather than try to compete with all of that, I thought I'd speak from my own experience. I thought I'd offer an Arab perspective on my part of the world and our hopes for peace and progress, especially with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm guessing, since you made the time to be here today when you could have been doing something really important, like researching a paper or visiting a professor or calling your mom to tell her just how much you love her, that this is an audience that already cares about international relations. But I do realize that foreign policy isn't typically a top concern for the American public, and especially not in the time of economic hardship at home. A poll earlier this year found that 75% of Americans agreed terrorism should be one of President Obama's top priorities, but almost no other foreign policy issues made it to the top 20 list. So I don't expect that the Arab-Israeli conflict is foremost on most people's minds. Yet, in many ways, that conflict is at the core of US-Arab relations, or at least at the core of Arab public opinion of America. When Arabs were asked in a poll this spring what 2 steps by the US would improve their views of the United States the most, more than 40% said a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. The same poll found that 99% of people put the conflict in their top 5 priorities, and 1 in 3 say the Palestinian issue is their #1 concern. That's because, for us, the occupation is a hurt we feel each day. In Jordan, nearly 1/3 of our population are Palestinian refugees. Look at the people sitting on either side of you. Imagine one was a refugee, forced to seek haven in your country because her family had been driven from their own. In Jordan, we have to be concerned with the conflict because we are living with its consequences. We don't have the luxury of shifting our focus away. We know as well that the crisis in Palestine does not exist in a vacuum. What happens in Palestine is related to what happens in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria. The longer the conflict in Palestine persists, the weaker the moderate majority becomes, the more extremists gain leverage they can exploit, and the greater the risk of instability throughout our region. So, we appreciated President Obama's outreach in his Cairo speech. We appreciated his acknowledgement that the conflict remains a major source of tension between us, and his pledge to pursue a 2-state solution with patience and dedication. We appreciated the appointment of Senator George Mitchell as a special envoy. But we are impatient. When it comes to Palestine, time has not been a friend. To the contrary, sometimes Palestine seems like the land that time forgot. You know, when I started college back in 1988, Europe was divided. The United States had an existential foe called the USSR. Much of Latin America was ruled by juntas, South Africa by apartheid. Civil conflicts had been raging for decades, from Guatemala to Northern Ireland. Nelson Mandela lived in a cell, and Palestine was occupied. These were the problems we used to describe as intractable, even insoluble. Yet, hatreds have given way to handshakes, prisoners have become presidents. But not in Palestine. In Palestine, walls are going up, not coming down, 400 kilometers to be precise. The decades have brought what feels like an endless parade of starts and stalemates, missed opportunities, shattered hopes, and diminishing returns. And I'm not here to talk about blame. That doesn't get us anywhere. It's like tracing your finger on a Mobius strip, going round in an infinite loop. But coming from Jordan, I feel I must speak for those voices that Americans rarely hear, to describe the sense of identity theft that Palestinians have endured for over 60 years. Because their pain is about more than just the loss of their land, their olive trees, their livelihoods. Their grief is about more than just being kicked out of their homes in which their families have lived for generations. As one scholar put it, land is the geography of the Palestinian soul. Their very understanding of who they are is deeply rooted in the context of their environment. So each new claim on their ever-shrinking space feels like a blow to their very existence. Having no place to call their own is like having no identity at all. Think about it. When you enroll here at Yale, one of the first things you receive is an ID. It allows you access to residential colleges, dining halls, the library stacks. It opens doors. It gets you in. It shows that you belong. And when you leave Yale, you get a piece of paper to carry with you, a diploma that gives you status before you ever have to say a word. In the West Bank and Gaza, young people like you are given an ID as well. But this ID is not about access. It's only about limitation. It limits the boundaries of where they can go, what they can do, who they can be. It's a constant reminder that in others' eyes, they are less valuable, less important, simply less. UN sources report that almost 40% of the West Bank is now covered by settlement-related Israeli infrastructure: barriers, buffer zones, military bases, barbed wire, and barricades. Parents can't get to work. Students can't get to class. Sick people can't get to hospitals. All traffic is stopped, from people on foot to cars and trucks to ambulances. The wait can be hours, often only to find that passage is refused, relatives detained on their way to a family wedding, children searched, their notes ripped from their school books, grandparents forced to stand for hours holding packages and heavy bags. The unpredictability, anxiety, and humiliation are as wearing as the delay. And so much more than freedom of movement is lost when each day is defined by these checkpoints, with armed soldiers demanding Hawiyya, ID, Hawiyya, ID. Show me proof that you exist. The degradation is compounded by the sense that no one cares, that the outside world is oblivious to the hardships Palestinians endure, especially in Gaza, where for 2 years, families have faced the collective punishment of blockade. And for 3 months at the start of this year, they were subjected to devastating attack with no place to run and nowhere to hide, not even UN hospitals or schools. Today, 1 million people, almost 70% of Gaza's population, are refugees. Homes lie in rubble. Hospitals lack power. Sewage pipes threaten to burst. The economy has utterly collapsed. Unemployment is approaching 50%. One resident calls it a jail where no prisoner knows the length of his sentence. And not one penny of the billions of dollars pledged for reconstruction has gotten through. More than half the population of Gaza is under the age of 18. Children did not create this conflict, but they are its greatest victims. Just listen to the words of the 4 small children who were found by the Red Cross in January in the shell-battered neighborhood of Zaytoun, clinging to their mother's corpses. They couldn't speak. They were too weak to stand. They hadn't eaten for days, while the firefight raged outside the door and their families died inside. They survived, and they're alive, but that's not the same as surviving. These children had nothing but their mother's love, and now they have lost that too. And the worst threat of all is the cynicism so many people feel, the sense that Middle East peace is hopeless, that we'll never find a solution. Because if we throw up our hands and say, this problem is too hard, we're not just writing off a process or writing off a roadmap. We're writing off people's lives. But let me be clear. It isn't just the Palestinians' lives that are at stake here. Israelis, too, need a future of peace and security. They, too, need to be free of wailing sirens announcing an attack. And they, too, need to grow up without the shadow of walls and watchtowers. For as a columnist from a leading Israeli daily wrote this spring, one of the casualties of occupation may be a healthy state of Israel itself. So what must be done? On the political front, we need courage, accountability, and action. And we see signs of hope as President Obama and his team invest their time and capital in breathing life into negotiations for two viable, secure, sovereign states. We see signs of hope as all 22 members of the Arab League have offered Israel full recognition in exchange for withdrawal to its pre-1967 border. We see signs of hope as brave people on both sides say they are ready to give peace a chance. 64% of Palestinians and 40% of Israelis who support the Arab League plan. Now, all sides must take responsibility for building on this momentum. And let me say clearly, the responsibility includes the Arab world. We decry the actions of Israeli extremists, but must work harder to rein in our own. We look to the West to do more in support of Palestinian needs, but must do our part and must press the Palestinians toward unity among themselves. At the same time, as my husband, His Majesty King Abdullah, has said, it is time for Israel to choose, to integrate into the region accepted and accepting with normal relations with its neighbors, or to remain Fortress Israel, isolated and holding itself and the entire region a hostage to continuing confrontation. And from America, too, we need sustained commitment, creative engagement, and leadership to keep the parties on the path to peaceful coexistence. But we need even more, because true peace depends not just on new lines on a map. It is not just the walls on the land that must go. We have to take down the walls in our hearts. There has been so much pain, so much loss, so much fear, so much hatred and mistrust. True peace depends on reconnecting the bonds of our common humanity. I was moved by something J.K. Rowling said in her commencement at Harvard last year. She said that humans have the unique ability to think themselves into other people's places, to learn and understand new things they haven't actually experienced. And yet many choose to remain comfortably within the bounds of their own experience, never troubling to wonder how it would feel to have been born other than they are. They can refuse to hear screams or to peer inside cages. They can close their minds and hearts to any suffering that doesn't touch them personally. They can refuse to know. Rowling went on to say, I might be tempted to envy people who can live that way, except that I do not think that they have any fewer nightmares than I do. I think the willfully unimaginative see more monsters, she said. They are more afraid. She is right. So often we dread what we do not know. We live in fear of the things we cannot see. But we'll never move forward by closing ourselves off. The only way to grow is to reach out. To truly make peace in the Middle East or anywhere in the world, we all have to learn to think ourselves into other people's places, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to make room for other people's hopes and fears. For the more we appreciate one another's perspective, the more dimension and depth we add to our own. And in many respects, that's what a liberal education is all about. It's about asking questions without prejudicing the answers, drawing lessons from other people's experiences, testing and refining our own values and beliefs, developing the habits of an open mind. When we shine the light of inquiry, broad-mindedness, and compassion, that is how we find our way to our own best selves. The more open we become, the more we find we can contain. It's the lux that leads the way to the veritas. And when it comes to the Middle East, no matter how great the fears, no matter how deep the mistrust, if we shine that light, we are sure to reveal what has always and will always be true. There is no difference between the love the Palestinians and Israelis feel for their children. No difference between their laughter or their tears. We share one humanity. As one of my heroes, Desmond Tutu, likes to say, we, all of us, have been made for goodness. We have been made for laughter. We have been made for caring, for sharing, for compassion. For we do indeed inhabit a moral universe. And yes, goodness is powerful. Yale, as global citizens, we have a responsibility to one another. In our interconnected world, there are no zero-sum games. We win or lose together. We all have a stake in peace and justice, for all of us are diminished by their absence. Let us work together in the Middle East and around the world to make peace come true for good. Thank you all very much.
I want to thank the audience for submitting so many possible questions here. I'm trying to sift through, but I will take the privilege of the chair and start with one or two of my own, inspired by your remarks. I think the reaction of the audience suggests that virtually everyone here finds your appeal to open-mindedness and to hope for a solution in the Middle East, particularly with respect to Israel and Palestine, to be something inspiring and motivating for us all. I think one question to ask is, what role can the United States play? You spoke of President Obama charting a new direction. Are there ways that President Obama and the United States can give an assist to this process, and in particular, what kinds of actions might be called for on our part?
Absolutely. I really do believe that the two sides cannot do it on their own. And the United States plays an instrumental role in getting the two sides around the negotiating table. The United States has the role to play in terms of offering leadership, remaining engaged, being committed to the process. We need the United States to be to show the leadership in the process, to lead the way. To enforce, to be a referee, to give guardianship. There are so many sticking issues out there, and the settlements is one of the issues that have been an obstacle most recently. And we need someone to be a fair broker between the two sides. And it comes with the realization that peace is not just of strategic interest to the Palestinians and Israelis themselves, but for the entire world and for the United States as well. Peace is the one thing that's going to undermine the extremists in the region and undermine the radical ideology that has emerged in recent years. So we all have a vested interest in making sure that this conflict is resolved once and for all. And unfortunately, we've had so much process. We've had so many, we don't need political leaders, politicians dealing with papers. We need politicians dealing with people. We don't need process. We need projects on the ground, because the incremental steps that have been taken have really frustrated people. They've made people lose hope in the process, and they just feed the agendas of those who are opposed to peace. So we need concise and concrete and tangible steps on the ground that can really improve the lives of the people in Palestine and Israel.
Clearly, that's the central issue for the Obama administration to deal with in the Middle East. Are there others? Are there other things that the Arab world would look to this country to do over the years ahead in terms of strengthening our contribution?
If there's one thing that undermines U.S. credibility in our region, it is that issue, because it is, I think the world judges the United States when Israel breaks international law, or when they don't honor their commitments. For example, with the building of the separation wall, with the expansion of the settlements, with changes on the ground that have changed the multi-faith character of Jerusalem. People feel that Israel would not have been able to do that if the United States did not condone this. So the one thing that could really build up the credibility and show goodwill is if we reach a fair and just solution to this issue. Of course, outreach to the Arab world is very important, and President Obama's approach and his diplomacy with our region, and his vision for a relationship that's based on mutual trust and mutual interests has really been welcomed in the Arab world. Of course, you know, you have the issues in Iraq, and you know, there's obviously the issue in Iran and all of those areas, but I think it's a matter of engaging the Arab world, listening to, and having a real measured and studied approach when you deal with our region.
That's great. Let me take one question from the audience. That you've been a very vocal proponent of the UN Millennium Goals. Obviously, we all have concerns, and there just was a report last week about how the slowdown in the worldwide economy has affected prospects for realizing those goals. You know, that hunger and some areas is actually worsening, not getting better. What's your prognosis? How do you see any prospect of reaching those goals by 2015?
So in the year 2000, world leaders came together and they came up with 8 promises that they made for this world. You know, ending hunger, getting children into school, reducing child mortality, dealing with environmental issues. 8 promises, and we're supposed to reach them by the year 2015. And you know, those promises were a mandate to change the story of human history. And you know, it's been said that promises are a uniquely human way of ordering the future. So back then, world leaders had the compassion, the commitment to make those promises. Now we're 2/3 of the way there, and as you mentioned, I think we're far from reaching many of those goals. The one that I've been focusing on the most is education. And today we have about 75 million children out of school. To get them into school will require $11 billion a year, which might sound like a lot, but it is less than what the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost in 1 month. So when you think about it, it's actually the bargain of the century. It's the best investment we can make. What's required is for us to create the critical mass of supporters for these goals, so that the leaders feel the pressure to fulfill their commitments and fulfill the pledges that they made for those children in the developing world. I think, you know, we all owe it to the mothers and fathers who want to give their children education, just like, you know, we all cared, your parents cared about sending you here because they understand how critical it is for the way that your life is going to look for you to get a quality education. So what we really require is more awareness and a rallying of the public behind some of these goals.
No, education, of course, has been a major emphasis of your own in Jordan, and you know, we look at it, of course, from a bit of a parochial perspective. We would like to see more Middle Eastern students come to this country, and I think, as we know, we were talking just before this session about the dropping off of applicants to the United States from the Middle East right after 9/11 in the first few years. Recently, the numbers have started to turn back up. Overall, international applications were actually up 7% last year. But there's still reluctance in the Middle East to come to the United States. What can places like Yale do to help convince you know, your constituencies and others in the Middle East that this is a welcoming and a friendly place, and that we actually want Middle Eastern students? Are there strategies you would recommend for us?
Well, let me start by saying that the United States' status in the world was not born out of its size or military might or politics around the world. It comes from the principles and values upon which this country was found. Because the United States is more than a country, it is a concept. It is a concept of openness, diversity, tolerance, acceptance, meritocracy, innovation, philanthropy. All of these are the values that make the United States what it is in the world.
That was a pretty good advertisement for the United States.
Well, let me finish my answer. We're not there yet. So to keep that status, I think the United States will be well advised to preserve those values.
Absolutely.
And not having, being able to open your doors to the best and brightest from all over the world is extremely instrumental to be able to maintain these values. And, you know, I see all over the world other countries who are, you know, building great universities, trying to attract students. I would hate to see the United States slide in that regard. So it's so important for you to maintain that diversity, to maintain that openness, to really attract people from all over the world. It's only, it would be a loss to the States if you didn't. And one way to do that is to reassure those young people that they will be treated fairly if they come to this country, that they don't want to be discriminated against, they don't want to be singled out. Right. And unfortunately, some stereotypes have been quite pervasive, and that has scared a lot of people from my part of the world from coming to the United States, and so they've chosen to go to Europe or Canada or any other country. So I hope that this trend is reversed, and a little bit of openness and acceptance, I think, will go a long way.
I think that's, yeah, I certainly agree. Actually, there's a question from one of the students in the audience that relates to this question of stereotyping, which you might want to tackle, which is, and I'll read this one exactly. There's discussion among Arab students here in the United States about who has more of a responsibility to break down stereotypes, Arabs or non-Arabs, because both have stereotypes of each other. And there's not always agreement. So what do you think of this line of argument? Does one group have more of a responsibility than the other, or is this something both
absolutely,
groups share?
And I have no doubt in my mind that both groups have an equal amount of effort to do. This is about a dialogue, it involves two people, and it has to go both ways. Right. We are just as guilty of stereotypes towards the West as the West is of stereotypes towards us. And you know, there has been a gulf that has emerged in recent years, particularly after 9/11. And it's incumbent on all of us moderates to try to break that. You know, the one thing I find is that extremists and those with a radical ideology, they are willing to act on their beliefs, but the moderates are not as willing. You know, they may show apathy. We can sometimes be lazy. But what's the point of having beliefs if we don't act on them? You know, if we are for openness and diversity and equal rights and freedoms, what's the point of having those beliefs without really doing something about it? And that's where the radicals and extremists have one up on us, because, for example, you know, we find that in countries around the world, education is a battleground, with youth being on the front lines, and extremists try to get in there and fill their minds with content, you know, with extreme ideologies, with hatred towards the rest of the world, with preaching violence. But what are we doing? We're not even going there. Yeah. So, you know, we need to go into the areas that we have left vacant, and that is primarily our youth's minds, and try to get them in the right direction. And you all have a very important role to do.
Will you get them to believe in the values you articulated about what America stands for, and we will try to get President Obama to get a solution in Palestine.
You have a deal.
I know that another passion of yours are women's issues and the rights of women, and indeed the opportunities for women. And actually there are a number of questions from the audience. I'll try to just pick one about that issue. And I think this is an interesting one. Could you give us some specific ways by which women's empowerment could be achieved in an Islamic cultural context? Are there special avenues, or are there particular things that could be done to?
Well, one thing I've found over the years a little bit frustrating is that when people look at women in Muslim countries, they tend to, you know, look at our region as one monolithic whole, when the reality is that different women in different countries are in different circumstances and have achieved different levels of progress. So there's no single mold for an Arab woman, just like there's no single mold for an American woman. You know, the status of women in the Arab world and Muslim world depends on her upbringing, her family, her education, etc. So that's one thing that we have to sort of clear. And
another stereotype to
another stereotype.
Break down.
We find that in many countries in the Arab world, women are making incredible progress. Some countries, they face many challenges. We definitely have to work on some of the legal aspects and legal rights for women. We have to work on the education to break down some of the stereotypes that are in our curricula. Most importantly, we have to get more women in the workplace, because we find that although we've attained high levels of education for women, not many women are going into the workplace. So there are many challenges that we have to overcome. But the one thing that I always sort of encounter, it's the mindsets. You know, it's age-old perceptions It's societal habits that just need to be changed and refined. Those are the things, those are the obstacles that hold women back. And more we really have to focus on changing.